Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back more than 3,000 years to a place where the desert stretched quietly toward the horizon. The Nile rose and fell with reassuring predictability, and an astonishing number of people devoted an incredible amount of time to making sure someone stayed dead in the most comfortable way imaginable. So if you've had a long day, settle into your favorite chair, pull up a blanket, dim the lights if you can, and let your thoughts wander slowly toward ancient Egypt. There's no need to remember every detail. No quiz awaits you at the end. We are simply taking an unhurried stroll through one of history's most remarkable traditions. Tonight we'll follow the gentle, painstaking journey of a single body as it becomes a mummy. Along the way, we'll meet careful embalmers, anxious family members, patient priests, beautifully carved coffins, jars guarded by strange divine beings, and a civilization that believed death was not really the end of anything. It was simply another journey. A rather complicated journey, admittedly. Ancient Egyptians had a remarkable talent for turning even the afterlife into an administrative process. So take a slow breath, get comfortable, and let's begin. Imagine the sun rising over the Nile. Farmers are already awake. Boats drift along calm water. Somewhere beyond the busy villages stands a quiet workshop near the edge of the desert. The location isn't accidental. The Egyptians buried their dead on the western side of the Nile whenever possible. The sun set in the west every evening, disappearing below the horizon before returning again the next morning. To them, this daily cycle mirrored death and rebirth. Naturally, geography became theology. The west belonged to the dead, the east belonged to the living. It was wonderfully organized. Now imagine that someone important has recently died. Perhaps a wealthy official, perhaps a respected noblewoman, perhaps even a pharaoh. News spreads quickly among relatives. Professional mourners arrive. Family members begin preparing funeral arrangements. But unlike many cultures, burial will not happen tomorrow, not even next week. Instead, the entire process may last around 70 days. Because eternity, apparently, deserved careful scheduling. The body arrives at the embalming workshop. To modern eyes, the building might look surprisingly ordinary. No enormous temples, no shining pyramids. Just skilled workers preparing for an extremely specialized task. These embalmers spent years learning their craft. Their knowledge passed from one generation to another. They understood which materials slowed decay, which oils preserved skin, and how different treatments affected the body. They didn't understand bacteria, of course, no microscopes, no modern chemistry. Yet, through centuries of observation, they became remarkably effective preservation experts. Sometimes, experience quietly solves problems long before science explains them. The family would also face an important decision. How expensive should the funeral be? Ancient Egypt, like every civilization before and since, understood that budgets exist. Not everyone could afford luxurious treatment. The wealthiest families selected the finest preservation methods. Middle class families chose something more modest. Poor families often received much simpler burials. Even in the afterlife, financial planning remained inconveniently relevant. For elite burials, the first stage involved purification. The body was carefully washed using water from the Nile. Priests burned fragrant incense nearby. Special prayers filled the air. Nothing happened quickly. Every movement carried symbolic meaning. Death wasn't considered pollution. Instead, it marked the beginning of transformation. The deceased wasn't disappearing. They were preparing to become something new. Ancient Egyptian religion centered on balance, continuity, and order. They believed every human possessed several spiritual components. The body itself remained important. The Ka, often described as a life force, still needed a recognizable home. The Ba, represented as a bird with a human head, could travel between worlds. Eventually, these spiritual elements reunited, but only if the body survived. which explains why Egyptians became rather obsessed with preventing decomposition. Rotting presented practical difficulties. If the body disappeared, where exactly would the soul return? An awkward situation, spiritually speaking. So, preservation became absolutely essential. The embalmers began with the most famous, and perhaps least glamorous, part of the process: removing the brain. Contrary to modern assumptions, Egyptians didn't consider the brain especially important. The heart held intelligence. The heart remembered. The heart made decisions. The brain mostly occupied space inside the skull. Rather unfair, perhaps, especially considering everything our brains quietly accomplish for us. Using a long hooked instrument inserted through the nostril, embalmers carefully broke through delicate bone leading into the skull. The brain tissue was gradually loosened. Some portions liquefied naturally. Other pieces were gently extracted. Eventually, the skull became empty. It sounds extraordinary today. Yet for Egyptian embalmers, it was simply another day's work. Oddly enough, they usually left the skull otherwise intact. The person's face remained recognizable. Recognition mattered enormously. Next came the internal organs. A careful incision appeared on the left side of the abdomen, not excessively large, just enough to remove organs that decomposed quickly. The stomach, the intestines, the lungs, the liver, each required separate treatment. The heart, however, usually remained exactly where it belonged, because the heart would later face judgment. According to Egyptian belief, after death, every person appeared before the great god Osiris. Their heart rested upon one side of a scale. On the opposite side lay the feather of Ma'at. The feather represented truth, justice, balance. If the heart proved lighter than or balanced with the feather, eternal life awaited. If not, things became considerably less pleasant. A terrifying creature called Amit waited nearby, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. Apparently, someone decided combining Egypt's most dangerous animals into one supernatural employee would improve efficiency. Amit simply consumed unworthy hearts. No second chances, no appeals process, no lengthy paperwork, just immediate consequences. Which made keeping your heart extremely important, literally. The removed organs required preservation too. They weren't simply discarded. Each organ was carefully dried and wrapped before being placed inside beautifully decorated containers known today as canopic jars. 4 jars. 4 protective spirits, each with a distinctive head. One appeared human, another resembled a baboon, another a jackal. The last took the form of a falcon. Together they watched over the deceased for eternity. Or at least they intended to. One imagines they hoped eternity remained relatively uneventful. With the organs removed, embalmers turned toward perhaps the single most important stage: drying. Moisture encouraged decay. Remove moisture. Slow decomposition dramatically. The Egyptians accomplished this using natron. Natron occurred naturally in dry lake beds. It looked rather ordinary, a pale mixture of naturally occurring salts, not particularly glamorous. Yet it proved astonishingly effective. The body became completely surrounded by natron, inside, outside, every available surface. The salt slowly absorbed moisture over many weeks. Nothing rushed. The workshop remained quiet. Visitors likely came and went. Priests continued prayers. Family members waited. Outside, life along the Nile continued almost unchanged. Markets opened, children played, farmers harvested grain, cats wandered exactly where they pleased. Because of course they did. Several thousand years later, cats remained deeply committed to behaving as though humanity merely rent space from them. After around 40 days, the transformation became visible. The body looked thinner, the skin darkened slightly. Much of the moisture had disappeared. Decay had slowed dramatically. For ancient embalmers, this represented success. Remarkably impressive success. Modern scientific examinations confirmed just how effective these techniques could be. Many mummies survived astonishingly well across thousands of years. Time itself struggled to erase their features. With drying complete, the embalmers gently removed remaining natron. The body no longer resembled someone peacefully asleep. Instead, it looked fragile, lightweight, almost delicate. The next task involved restoring a more lifelike appearance. Empty spaces inside the body required filling. Otherwise, the chest and abdomen would collapse inward. That hardly suited someone expecting eternal existence. So, embalmers carefully packed the body with clean linen, sawdust, plant fibers, or resin-soaked materials. Different workshops used different methods. The goal remained consistent: maintain natural shape, preserve dignity, allow the deceased to appear recognizable. Appearance mattered deeply, not because of vanity, but because identity mattered. The afterlife required knowing exactly who you were, and preferably looking somewhat familiar while doing so. The skin then received generous applications of oils and fragrant resins. Some substances came from surprisingly distant regions through long trade routes. Ancient Egypt maintained extensive commercial connections reaching far beyond its borders. Even funerals quietly reflected international trade. A pleasant-smelling eternity apparently justified expensive imports. Now the body rested once again, no longer merely human remains, not yet fully a mummy, instead something between worlds. Prepared patiently, waiting for the final intricate stage that would transform careful preservation into sacred ritual. And that slow, meticulous wrapping would become an art form unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. The body now rests quietly inside the embalming workshop. Weeks have already passed. Outside, the Nile continues its gentle rhythm. Boats drift along the water. Bakers prepare bread before sunrise. Scribes patiently fill papyrus scrolls with careful handwriting that would make modern doctors seem wonderfully easy to read. Life moves forward. It always does. Yet, inside the workshop, time seems slower. The embalmers have reached the stage that many people picture first when they think of ancient Egypt: the wrapping. It sounds straightforward enough. Take a body, wrap it in linen, finish before lunch. But naturally, the ancient Egyptians found a way to transform a practical task into a ritual so detailed that even the most organized modern gift wrapper might quietly admit defeat. This was not one long strip of cloth, nor was it completed in a single afternoon. Instead, hundreds of narrow linen bandages were prepared with extraordinary care. Some were only a few centimeters wide, others were much broader. Every strip had a purpose, every layer carried meaning. Many wealthy families donated old but valuable linen garments for the process. Egyptian linen was precious. Made from flax, it required an astonishing amount of labor to produce. Growing the plants, harvesting them, separating the fibers, spinning thread, weaving cloth. An ordinary piece of linen represented many hours of careful work, so wrapping a mummy in hundreds of meters of fabric was no small expense. Death, as it turned out, could become remarkably costly. The embalmers began with the fingers. Each finger received its own tiny wrapping, patiently, carefully, one at a time. The toes followed, each individually wrapped as well. No shortcuts. Apparently, every toe deserved eternal respect. Once the fingers and toes were finished, the hands and feet received additional layers. Then came the arms, the legs, the head, finally the entire body. Each section disappeared beneath smooth white linen until the deceased resembled a carefully folded work of art. Between many of these layers, the embalmers placed warm tree resins. The sticky resin acted almost like glue. It held the wrappings firmly together. It also helped protect the body from moisture and insects. Again, they knew nothing about microorganisms. Yet centuries of experience had taught them exactly which natural substances preserved human remains best. Knowledge sometimes arrives quietly, long before anyone understands why it works. As the wrapping continued, small protective objects appeared beside the body. These were amulets, tiny charms carved from precious stones, glazed pottery, gold, or colorful glass. Some were hardly larger than a thumbnail. Others covered much of the chest. Each possessed symbolic power, or at least everyone sincerely hoped it did. One of the most common amulets was the Eye of Horus. It represented protection, healing, wholeness. Legend told that the god Horus had lost one of his eyes during a terrible struggle. The eye was later restored. Because ancient Egyptian mythology rarely believed that broken things needed to stay broken forever. Another favorite was the scarab beetle. Now, beetles may not immediately strike us as glamorous. Most people today notice one crawling nearby and quietly step away, preferably in the opposite direction. The Egyptians, however, admired scarab beetles immensely. They watched these insects rolling balls across the ground. To them, it resembled the sun moving across the sky. This simple observation inspired an extraordinary religious symbol. The scarab became associated with rebirth, renewal, the beginning of each new day. Small, scarab amulets were tucked gently among the linen layers. One especially important version rested directly above the heart. Known today as the heart scarab, it often carried an inscription asking the heart not to betray its owner during judgment. Imagine that, even after death, people worried their own heart might accidentally reveal embarrassing truths. It was essentially an ancient reminder saying, please, just this once, keep quiet. Many modern family gatherings operate under similar principles. As wrapping continued, priests quietly recited sacred words. These were not random prayers. Each phrase served a purpose. Some protected the body, others guided the soul. Still others asked the gods for safe passage into the next life. Words possessed enormous power in Egyptian belief. Speaking something correctly helped make it true. Names carried particular importance. To know someone's true name meant possessing influence over them, which explains why pharaohs carved their names onto monuments everywhere imaginable. It certainly celebrated achievement, but it also helped ensure eternal remembrance. Being forgotten represented a second death, one far more frightening than the first, because if no one remembered your name, did you truly continue to exist? The Egyptians hoped the answer remained yes, but they preferred not to test the theory. As the linen layers grew thicker, beautiful painted masks might be added for wealthy individuals. These masks weren't intended as perfect portraits. Instead, they represented an idealized version of the deceased, healthy, calm, serene, eternally youthful. History has always enjoyed flattering official portraits. Social media filters simply continue a tradition thousands of years old. Royal masks became especially magnificent. The most famous, of course, belonged to the young king Tutankhamun. His golden funeral mask has become one of history's greatest artistic treasures. Its calm expression still seems strangely peaceful after more than 3,000 years. Eyes gaze forward, lips remain gently closed, nothing appears hurried. The mask quietly suggests confidence, as though eternity itself has already been carefully scheduled. Meanwhile, ordinary Egyptians rarely received anything so elaborate. Their burials reflected available resources, simple wrappings, plain coffins, modest grave goods. Yet the hope remained remarkably similar. Every family wanted their loved ones to arrive safely in the next world. The destination mattered more than luxury. Still, if luxury happened to be available, no one objected. Once wrapping was complete, the mummy often received broad linen sheets covering the entire body. Long ribbons crossed over the chest. Decorative patterns emerged. The finished result appeared elegant rather than frightening. This wasn't intended to hide death. It honored it. At last, the embalmers stepped back. Weeks of careful labor now rested before them. What had once been an ordinary human body had become something profoundly different. Not alive, not forgotten, prepared, ready for eternity, but one enormous task still remained. The coffin, actually, Several coffins, because ancient Egyptians developed an understandable enthusiasm for placing one beautifully decorated coffin inside another, like the world's most elaborate nesting dolls. A wealthy noble might receive 2 or 3 wooden coffins. A king might receive even more protection. The innermost coffin fit closely around the body, the next surrounded it, then another. Finally, everything rested inside an enormous stone sarcophagus. If one layer offered protection, surely 4 layers offered even greater reassurance. Naturally, each coffin carried vibrant paintings. Hieroglyphic inscriptions covered the surface. Protective spells appeared alongside images of gods and goddesses. Bright blues, deep reds, rich greens, golden yellows. Many surviving coffins remain astonishingly colorful today. Time has faded them, but not erased them. Artists painted idealized faces on the lids. The deceased looked peaceful, eyes open, watching, waiting, ready to awaken in another world. One begins to appreciate how differently Egyptians viewed death. Modern cultures often avoid discussing it. Ancient Egypt surrounded death with color, art, stories, preparation, conversation, rather than pretending mortality didn't exist. They planned for it, extensively, perhaps even enthusiastically. One suspects their estate planners remained permanently employed. Before the funeral procession could begin, another remarkable tradition unfolded. Professional mourners gathered, some genuinely grieved, others had been hired. This was perfectly respectable. Their role involved expressing sorrow publicly, crying loudly, singing funeral laments, covering themselves with dust, tearing at their clothing, displaying visible grief honored the deceased. A quiet funeral might appear almost disrespectful. Today, we sometimes hire photographers. The Egyptians occasionally hired mourners. Different services, similar desire to create a meaningful farewell. Soon family members assembled beside the completed mummy. Some whispered private prayers. Others left gifts, small personal belongings, jewelry, letters, flowers, perhaps simple objects that carried memories. Across thousands of years, human affection changes surprisingly little. People still search for one last meaningful gesture, one final way of saying, "You mattered." And in ancient Egypt, they hoped those gifts would remain useful forever, because tomorrow the procession would leave the embalming house. The long journey toward the tomb was about to begin, and waiting at the entrance would be one final ceremony. A ritual believed to restore every sense needed for eternal life. A ceremony so important that without it, many Egyptians feared the afterlife might never truly begin. Morning arrives quietly over the Nile. The first light catches the tops of palm trees before slowly reaching the river itself. Fishermen push their boats away from the shore. Bakers tend warm ovens. Somewhere, a donkey has already decided to complain about absolutely everything. Some things, it seems, are timeless. Today is the funeral. Nearly 70 days have passed since the death. The long work of the embalmers is complete. The linen wrappings have been carefully tied. The amulets rest safely beneath their layers. The painted coffin stands ready. Now begins the final journey from the world of the living to the home prepared for eternity. For the family, this is not simply a burial, it is an escort. Their loved one is traveling to another existence, and like any important journey, it requires planning, ceremony, and perhaps just a little optimism. The procession moves slowly, there is no rush. Ancient Egyptian funerals were meant to be seen. Priests walk at the front, carrying incense burners whose fragrant smoke curls gently into the morning air. Behind them come servants carrying offerings, baskets of bread, jars of beer, fresh vegetables, fruit, cuts of meat, bouquets of lotus flowers, everything a person might appreciate during an eternal existence. One suspects the bread remained considerably fresher on the day it was offered than it eventually became. Fortunately, symbolism was doing much of the heavy lifting. Family members follow behind. Some cry openly, others remain silent. Professional mourners continue their carefully practiced expressions of grief, raising their arms dramatically toward the sky. To modern eyes, it may appear theatrical, yet for the Egyptians, public mourning demonstrated love and respect. Grief, after all, was never intended to be hidden. As the procession reaches the edge of the desert, the landscape begins to change. The green fields of the Nile Valley slowly disappear. Golden sand stretches outward. Low hills rise gently in the distance. This is the land of the dead, dry, quiet, almost perfectly suited for preserving what time usually claims. Long before elaborate embalming techniques existed, nature itself had accidentally taught the Egyptians an important lesson. Thousands of years earlier, people had been buried directly in shallow desert graves. The hot, dry sand naturally removed moisture from the body. Many remains survived remarkably well. It was an unexpected discovery. The desert had quietly invented mummification before human beings improved upon the idea. Ancient embalmers merely refined what nature had already demonstrated. Eventually, the procession arrives at the tomb. Its appearance depends entirely upon wealth. A poor family might have prepared a modest grave with only a few possessions. A wealthy official could have an elaborate underground complex decorated with colorful paintings. A pharaoh, naturally, preferred something rather more ambitious. Some kings built tombs that took decades to complete. Entire teams of architects, artists, laborers, and stonecutters devoted years of their lives to preparing a single resting place. One almost wonders if anyone occasionally looked at the construction schedule and quietly muttered, "Couldn't we have made eternity just a little less complicated?" Apparently not. The tomb itself was not simply a place to store a body. It was intended to function as an eternal house. Every detail reflected this idea. Walls displayed scenes of daily life, farming, fishing, banquets, gardens, musicians, servants preparing meals, children playing, dogs chasing birds, cats sitting with the quiet confidence of creatures who have always assumed they are in charge. The Egyptians hoped these painted scenes would somehow continue into the next world. Life after death was imagined not as a strange, mysterious realm beyond imagination. Instead, it looked surprisingly familiar. Fields remained fertile, families reunited, food appeared plentiful. Work existed, although hopefully rather less exhausting. The ideal afterlife resembled Egypt itself, only slightly improved, a comforting thought. At the entrance to the tomb, priests prepare for one final ceremony. It is among the most important rituals in all of ancient Egyptian religion. Today, we call it the opening of the mouth ceremony. The name sounds rather unusual, almost like a medical procedure. In reality, it was something entirely different. According to Egyptian belief, death had temporarily closed the senses. The deceased could no longer breathe, eat, speak, hear, or see. The ritual symbolically restored these abilities. Priests approached the mummy carrying specially crafted ceremonial tools. One resembled a small metal blade. Another looked almost like an adze used in woodworking. Each instrument had symbolic meaning. The chief priest gently touched the mouth of the mummy, then the eyes, the ears, the nose, each movement accompanied by carefully spoken prayers. The words invited the senses to awaken once again. May your mouth be opened. May your eyes see. May your ears hear. May you breathe forever. It was not considered magic in the modern sense. Rather, these actions completed the transformation from ordinary human remains into someone fully prepared for eternal life. The ritual reached back centuries. Even kings underwent the same ceremony. Death, after all, showed very little interest in titles. However, once the ritual concluded, offerings were presented: fresh bread, beer, water, wine, fruit, incense, flowers, small cakes sweetened with honey. The priests arranged them neatly before the tomb. Food held enormous symbolic importance. The deceased still required nourishment, not necessarily the physical bread itself, but its spiritual essence. The Egyptians believed that carefully offered food continued serving its purpose beyond the visible world. It is a wonderfully practical view of eternity. No one wished to begin everlasting existence feeling hungry. Among the offerings stood small statues unlike any others. These tiny figures are known today as ushabtis. Most stood only a few inches tall. They were carved from wood, stone, or brightly glazed faience. Each figure represented a servant. The Egyptians expected that work would still exist in the afterlife. Fields would need tending, canals maintained, harvests gathered. Of course, no wealthy Egyptian was especially enthusiastic about personally doing all this labor forever, so they prepared substitutes. If the gods requested work, the Ushabti was expected to answer, not the deceased. One can almost imagine the tiny statue stepping forward with quiet resignation. I suppose I'll handle this. Some wealthy tombs contained hundreds of Ushabtis, one for every possible working day. Ancient outsourcing, if you will. It was efficient, optimistic, and perhaps just a little unfair for the statues. Though fortunately, they never seem to have complained. The walls surrounding these figures often carried beautiful hieroglyphic inscriptions. Contrary to popular imagination, hieroglyphs were not mysterious secret codes. They formed a complete writing system. Some symbols represented sounds, others represented entire words. Still others acted as helpful clues explaining meaning. Learning to read and write hieroglyphs required years of education. Scribes belonged to one of Egypt's most respected professions. They avoided heavy physical labor, worked indoors, maintained important records. It was an attractive career, especially if one preferred ink stains over lifting enormous stones beneath the desert sun. The tomb paintings themselves reveal remarkable details about daily Egyptian life. Artists painted livestock with astonishing accuracy. Different species of birds. Fish swimming through marshes. Workers harvesting grain. Craftsmen making furniture. Children playing games. Musicians entertaining guests. These scenes served religious purposes. Yet they also preserved priceless glimpses into ordinary existence. Ironically, people trying to prepare for eternity accidentally became some of history's greatest documentary artists. Because of them, thousands of years later, we can still watch slices of everyday Egyptian life unfold across painted walls. There is something quietly comforting about that. As preparations continue, family members spend time inside the tomb. Some speak softly to the deceased, others simply stand in silence. Children watch the ceremonies with wide eyes. Perhaps they understand only part of what is happening. Perhaps adults don't understand all of it either. Faith rarely answers every question. Sometimes it simply offers a path through uncertainty. Eventually, the moment arrives. The coffin is carried into the burial chamber. Several strong workers carefully lower it into place. If multiple coffins have been prepared, each fits inside the next with remarkable precision. Finally, the great stone sarcophagus receives them all. Its massive lid is slowly lowered. The sound of stone meeting stone echoes briefly through the chamber. Then, silence, not an empty silence, a peaceful one. Outside, final offerings are arranged. Oil lamps flicker gently. Priests complete the last prayers. The family takes one final look before leaving. Some may return during festivals. Others will bring additional offerings throughout the years. The relationship between the living and the dead does not end today. It simply changes. The tomb entrance is gradually sealed. Workers place stones carefully. Sand begins drifting against the outer walls. The desert, patient as always, resumes its quiet watch. Inside, surrounded by painted gardens, carefully written prayers, protective amulets, treasured possessions, and enough supplies to satisfy even the most meticulous eternal traveler. The mummy waits, not in fear, not in loneliness, but with every expectation of awakening into another life. And while the family returns to the living world beside the Nile, the remarkable journey of the soul, according to ancient Egyptian belief, is only just beginning. The tomb is sealed, the last footsteps fade into the warm desert air, and the silence settles gently over the landscape. It is a different kind of silence than we might imagine today. To us, a sealed tomb feels final. To the ancient Egyptians, it was more like closing the front door behind a traveler who had just begun a very long journey. Their loved one was not simply lying inside, they were expected to continue living. Only the destination had changed. This idea shaped nearly every part of Egyptian religion. Death was rarely described as an ending. Instead, It was another chapter. Admittedly, it was a chapter involving considerably more linen than most people would prefer. Still, the Egyptians approached it with remarkable confidence. According to their beliefs, the soul now began traveling through the mysterious realm known today as the Duat. The Duat was not exactly heaven, nor was it quite the underworld as later cultures imagined it. It was something in between, a vast landscape of rivers, lakes, gates, islands, deserts, monsters, protective spirits, and divine beings. Imagine trying to navigate an unfamiliar city without a map. Now, imagine the city contains magical serpents several meters long. Preparation suddenly seems like an excellent idea. Fortunately, the deceased was not expected to memorize every turn. Inside many tombs rested carefully written collections of spells. Modern scholars call one of the most famous collections the Book of the Dead. Despite its dramatic modern title, it was never a single book, nor did every Egyptian own the same version. Instead, families commissioned customized papyrus scrolls containing prayers, magical formulas, instructions, and protective texts. Think of it as an extremely optimistic travel guide. Except the travel destination lasted forever. Some scrolls stretched several meters in length. Artists filled them with colorful illustrations. Gods stood beside sacred boats. Monsters waited near gateways. The deceased appeared calmly speaking with divine beings. Everything looked surprisingly organized. Even the afterlife, it seems, appreciated good paperwork. These scrolls explained what to say at dangerous moments. Names of protective gods, passwords for mysterious gates, prayers to avoid unpleasant encounters. Apparently, eternity required rather more introductions than one might expect. One famous passage instructed the deceased to declare their innocence before 42 divine judges. Modern historians call this the negative confession. It did not involve admitting guilt, quite the opposite. The deceased calmly listed actions they had not committed. I have not stolen. I have not murdered. I have not cheated. I have not caused unnecessary suffering. It was less about claiming perfection and more about demonstrating a life lived in harmony with Ma'at. Ma'at was among the most important ideas in all of Egyptian civilization. She was both a goddess and a principle, truth, justice, balance, order, everything that allowed the universe to function peacefully. The opposite of Ma'at was chaos. And chaos, naturally, tended to make everyone's day considerably worse. Pharaohs claimed they ruled in accordance with Ma'at. Judges attempted to uphold it. Ordinary people hoped to live by it. Even the gods respected it. The universe itself depended upon balance. It is a surprisingly comforting philosophy. Life becomes difficult. People make mistakes. Floods arrive. Kings occasionally behave like mildly confused geese wearing crowns. Yet somehow balance can still be restored. Eventually, the deceased reaches perhaps the most famous moment in Egyptian mythology, the Hall of Judgment. Here stands Osiris, the great king of the dead. Unlike later images of terrifying judges, Osiris often appears calm, dignified, wrapped in white, holding a crook and flail. His skin is usually painted green. Not because he was feeling unwell, green symbolized renewal, vegetation, and rebirth. Life returning after the annual flood. Standing nearby is Anubis, the jackal-headed god. Modern audiences sometimes assume Anubis ruled the underworld. In truth, his role resembled something closer to a careful guardian and guide. He watched over burials, protected tombs, escorted souls. He possessed an air of quiet professionalism. If the ancient Egyptian afterlife had a particularly reliable civil servant, Anubis would probably receive the job. He performs the weighing of the heart. The ceremony is simple, elegant, terrifying. The deceased's heart rests upon one side of a great scale. On the other side lies the feather of Ma'at. Nothing more, no complicated machinery, just balance. If the scales remain even, or the heart proves lighter, The soul continues safely onward. If the heart becomes heavy with wrongdoing, then, waiting patiently beside the scales, is Amit. Poor Amit. History remembers her almost entirely for one unpleasant responsibility. She was part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, which, when one considers Egypt's wildlife, was rather an unfortunate combination. Three dangerous animals blended into one creature, as though the designers of mythology decided moderation simply wasn't necessary. Amit did not torture souls. She did not chase them endlessly. Her task was much simpler. She consumed hearts that failed judgment. After that, existence simply ended. To many Egyptians, this complete disappearance was the greatest punishment imaginable, not eternal suffering, just nothing. The desire to continue existing shaped almost everything they believed. Fortunately, if the heart passed judgment, the journey continued. The soul entered the field of reeds. This beautiful paradise resembled Egypt itself, only better. Fields stretched endlessly, harvests never failed. The Nile flowed peacefully, families reunited. There was enough food, enough water, enough shade beneath the trees, enough time. The Egyptians did not dream of escaping earthly life. They dreamed of perfecting it. There is something deeply human in that idea. Rather than imagining an entirely unfamiliar paradise, they hoped the best parts of home would simply continue forever. One imagines that after thousands of years, even paradise occasionally required a quiet afternoon beneath a tree. The gods themselves reflected familiar aspects of daily life. They laughed, argued, made mistakes, protected one another, sometimes quarreled spectacularly. Their stories explain nature, kingship, family, and change. Take Isis, for example, one of Egypt's most beloved goddesses. She became famous for her loyalty. When her husband Osiris was murdered, she searched tirelessly across Egypt to recover his scattered body. It is one of mythology's great stories of devotion. Patient, determined, remarkably persistent. She eventually restored him through divine magic, allowing him to become ruler of the dead. The myth also reinforced an important lesson. Even death itself could not entirely destroy love. Nearby stood Horus, their son, the falcon-headed protector of kings. His long struggle against his uncle Seth symbolized the eternal conflict between order and chaos. Generation after generation of pharaohs claimed to rule as the living Horus. A comforting bit of royal publicity, one might say. It certainly sounded more impressive than, "I inherited the throne because my father happened to own it." Religion and politics rarely lived very far apart. Meanwhile, back in the world of the living, the tomb did not become forgotten. Quite the opposite. Family members visited regularly. They brought fresh offerings: bread, beer, fruit, flowers, sometimes letters addressed directly to the deceased. These surviving letters are among the most touching documents from ancient Egypt. People wrote asking departed relatives for help, a successful harvest, recovery from illness, peace within the family. They believed their ancestors could still influence events. The relationship continued. Only the conversation became slightly more one-sided. Festivals honoring the dead filled the calendar. During certain celebrations, families gathered near tombs. They shared meals, remembered stories, spent time together. Death remained part of community life rather than something hidden away. It is a perspective quite different from many modern societies. Perhaps not better, perhaps not worse, simply different. And throughout all these ceremonies, one quiet hope remained unchanged: that the carefully prepared mummy resting beneath layers of linen, the beautifully painted coffin, the protective amulets, the sacred prayers, the faithful offerings, had all achieved their purpose, that somewhere beyond the visible world, the journey continued peacefully, while the desert winds drifted softly across the sealed tomb, and generations passed beneath the same Egyptian sun. The remarkable work of the embalmers would continue preserving one human life, not for years, not for centuries, but, astonishingly, for thousands of years still to come. For many centuries, the tomb remains exactly as its builders intended. Outside, the seasons continue their quiet rhythm. The Nile rises, the Nile falls. Children grow into adults. Old kings are replaced by young ones. New temples appear along the river, others slowly begin to crumble beneath the patient weight of time. The mummy, however, rests in almost complete darkness. It has no awareness of the centuries passing above, no knowledge that entire dynasties will rise and disappear, no idea that languages will change, kingdoms will collapse, or that one day people from distant continents, places the ancient Egyptians never imagined, will stand in quiet amazement before its carefully wrapped form. Time inside a sealed tomb behaves differently. It feels almost still. Of course, not every tomb remained untouched. Ancient Egypt was a wealthy civilization, and wealthy civilizations tend to produce wealthy graves. Unfortunately, they also tend to produce tomb robbers. This was hardly a surprise. Even the Egyptians knew it would happen. In fact, records survived describing investigations into stolen royal tombs. Officials questioned suspects. Witnesses gave testimony. Some confessed, others insisted they knew absolutely nothing, despite somehow possessing rather suspicious quantities of royal jewelry. Human nature, it seems, has always been wonderfully predictable. Gold attracts attention. The earliest tomb robbers often lived only a short distance from the cemeteries they targeted. Many understood exactly where valuables had been placed. Some had even helped construct the tombs years before. If anyone knew the layout of hidden corridors, it was the builders themselves. One can almost imagine a laborer quietly thinking, I do remember where that magnificent golden necklace ended up. It was an unfortunate temptation. The authorities treated these crimes seriously. Royal tombs were sacred. Stealing from the dead was considered both criminal and deeply disrespectful. Punishments could be severe, yet theft continued, again and again, across generation after generation. Eventually, priests became increasingly concerned. Many royal tombs had already been disturbed. Some pharaohs no longer rested safely. Something had to be done. So, during the later periods of Egyptian history, priests made an extraordinary decision. They secretly opened certain royal tombs, not to rob them, to rescue them. Imagine entering the burial chamber of a king who had died hundreds of years earlier. The air would be dry, the silence complete. Torchlight would dance across painted walls that no one had seen for generations. Carefully, respectfully, priests lifted the ancient mummy from its damaged coffin. Any broken wrappings were repaired. Loose amulets were returned to their proper places. New linen might be added where necessary. Then the king was carried away under cover of secrecy. His new resting place remained hidden. Several royal mummies were eventually placed together inside carefully concealed caches, rather like a very exclusive reunion of former pharaohs. Nobody attending had much to say, yet together they quietly escaped countless future robbers. It was a remarkable act of preservation. Without those priests, many famous rulers might have vanished forever. Among these rescued kings was one of Egypt's greatest rulers, Ramesses II. He lived an extraordinarily long life for his era, around 90 years, according to most estimates. He fathered an astonishing number of children, more than 100. Historians still debate the exact number. One imagines palace birthday celebrations became increasingly complicated. Remembering everyone's name alone must have required considerable concentration. Ramesses built temples across Egypt, commissioned enormous statues of himself, signed one of history's earliest known peace treaties. Naturally, he also ensured that nearly every monument politely reminded visitors exactly who deserved the credit. Modesty rarely survives prolonged absolute power, yet despite all his achievements, despite immense wealth, despite commanding one of history's greatest civilizations, he eventually required the same careful embalming as everyone else. Death remained wonderfully impartial. His mummy survives today. Scientists have examined his face, his hair, his bones, even signs of arthritis. The mighty Pharaoh who once ruled millions can now quietly teach modern medicine about aging. History has an interesting sense of perspective. Part 3. Another remarkable mummy belonged to Sekenenretau. Unlike Ramesses, his remains tell a far more violent story. His skull bears several terrible wounds. Different weapons struck different parts of his head. For many years, historians debated exactly what happened. Did he die in battle? Was he executed? Captured? The evidence continues to provoke discussion. His mummy reminds us that even careful embalming could preserve not only peaceful faces, but also the final evidence of ancient tragedies. Each mummy tells a different story. Sometimes one of glory, sometimes one of quiet sorrow, sometimes simply one of ordinary life. Not all surviving mummies belong to kings. Many were priests, officials, craftsmen, musicians, children, mothers, fathers, people whose names would otherwise have disappeared completely. Their preservation allows us to glimpse everyday humanity across 3,000 years. Modern technology has transformed the way we study them. In the 19th century, archaeologists often unwrap mummies physically. Today, that sounds rather alarming. At the time, however, many believed they were conducting careful research. Unfortunately, the process permanently destroyed the original wrappings. Much valuable information disappeared. Sometimes curiosity moved faster than caution. Modern scientists take a gentler approach. Instead of removing the bandages, they frequently use CT scanners. Powerful imaging allows researchers to see inside the mummy without disturbing a single layer of linen. It is rather astonishing. Doctors can examine bones, teeth, jewelry, amulets, even tiny objects hidden beneath dozens of carefully wrapped layers. The embalmers would probably find the technology utterly bewildering, though perhaps quietly impressive. After all, they spent 70 days preserving the body. Modern medicine now studies their work without undoing it. CT scans have revealed broken bones that healed during life. Arthritis in elderly officials. Dental infections, evidence of heart disease. Ancient Egyptians smiled, worked, ached, grew old, very much like us. Some findings have surprised historians. One long-standing belief held that pharaohs lived exceptionally healthy lives. Not always. Rich food, limited exercise, stress, genetic problems. Royal families occasionally suffered from the same habits that trouble powerful people throughout history. Apparently, unlimited access to desserts has never been an especially wise long-term strategy. Even ancient monarchs struggled with moderation. One particularly fascinating discovery involves tattoos. Several mummies preserve delicate tattoo designs upon their skin. These markings survived because the skin itself survived. Thousands of years later, tiny patterns remain visible. Permanent art proved remarkably permanent after all. Scientists have also discovered traces of perfume, residues of ancient plant resins imported across great distances. Each chemical analysis adds another small piece to the puzzle. We begin to understand not only how Egyptians preserved bodies, but what their world smelled like, what materials they valued, how extensive their trade networks became. A single mummy can quietly reveal astonishing amounts of information, not because it speaks, but because it has waited patiently, very patiently. Meanwhile, museums around the world now care for these remarkable remains. Temperature is carefully controlled, humidity monitored, lighting kept low. Conservators work slowly, respectfully. The goal is no longer to uncover every possible secret immediately. Instead, it is to preserve these individuals for future generations. Future technologies may answer questions we cannot even ask today. That is one of history's gentlest lessons. Patience often rewards curiosity. And after waiting 3,000 years, a few more decades probably seem perfectly reasonable. As visitors quietly stand before an ancient mummy in a museum gallery, many experience an unusual feeling. This is not merely an artifact, not simply an archaeological discovery. It is a person, someone who laughed, worked, loved their family, worried about tomorrow, believed deeply that careful preparation would carry them safely into eternity. In a curious way, that hope succeeded, not exactly as they imagined. They expected to awaken in the field of reeds. Instead, they became remembered, studied, protected, their names spoken once more, their stories shared across countless generations. And perhaps, for people who believed that being forgotten was the greatest loss of all, there could be few stranger or more fitting forms of immortality. By now, our journey has carried us from the quiet embalming workshop to the sealed tomb, from the imagined pathways of the afterlife to the bright galleries of modern museums. And yet, one gentle question still lingers. Why? Why did an entire civilization devote so much care, so much skill, and so many precious resources to preserving the human body? The answer is not as simple as because they feared death. In many ways, they feared being forgotten far more. For the ancient Egyptians, memory had extraordinary power. A person's name was not merely a label, it was part of who they were, as long as someone spoke your name, read it, or even looked upon it carved into stone. Some part of you continued to exist. This explains why walls of temples, statues, and tombs are covered with names. Kings carved them into towering monuments. Officials had them painted onto coffins. Ordinary people inscribed them wherever they could afford. Sometimes a single name appears dozens of times inside one burial chamber, not because the artist forgot he had already written it. Quite the opposite. Repetition offered protection. If one inscription became damaged, another remained, and another. It was a remarkably practical approach to eternity. Of course, this also meant that enemies occasionally attacked names instead of bodies. When a pharaoh fell from favor, later rulers sometimes ordered every inscription bearing that king's name to be chiseled away. Statues were smashed, cartouches carefully erased, monuments claimed by someone else. It was an attempt to remove a ruler not only from politics, but from memory itself. One famous victim of this practice was the remarkable female Pharaoh Hatshepsut. She ruled Egypt successfully for more than 20 years. Trade flourished. Magnificent buildings rose from the desert. Her reign was stable and prosperous. Yet after her death, many images and inscriptions showing her were deliberately destroyed. For centuries, history nearly forgot she had ruled at all. Fortunately, stone is surprisingly stubborn. Enough evidence survived for archaeologists to piece together her story. It is a quiet reminder that history often whispers instead of shouting. Sometimes all it takes is one surviving inscription hidden beneath centuries of sand. The Egyptians also believed that pictures possessed a kind of life. When artists painted servants baking bread, those servants could continue providing bread forever. When gardens appeared upon tomb walls, those gardens continued blooming, at least spiritually. This helps explain why Egyptian art followed such careful rules. People are shown from familiar angles. Heads in profile, eyes facing forward. Shoulders turned toward the viewer, legs walking sideways. To us it looks unusual. To the Egyptians it showed the body completely. Every important part remained visible. Nothing essential disappeared. Accuracy mattered less than completeness. The paintings were not snapshots. They were eternal blueprints. Their purpose was not realism. Their purpose was permanence. Even animals received careful attention. Cats appear frequently. So do dogs. Monkeys, geese, cattle, fish, falcons. Each reflected part of everyday Egyptian life. Cats in particular occupied a rather comfortable position in society. They protected grain stores from mice, hunted snakes, and, judging by surviving artwork, accepted admiration with their usual effortless confidence. Some things truly never change. Many cats today still carry themselves as though they personally supervised the construction of the pyramids. Speaking of pyramids, it is worth gently clearing away one of history's most persistent myths. Not every mummy rested inside a pyramid. In fact, most did not. The Great Pyramids were built primarily during Egypt's Old Kingdom. Later kings chose hidden tombs cut deep into cliffs instead. These lay within what we now call the Valley of the Kings. The change made practical sense. Pyramids were magnificent. They were also astonishingly easy to find. One can hardly hide a structure taller than many modern office buildings. A concealed tomb offered rather better security. At least that was the hope. Unfortunately, determined tomb robbers proved surprisingly resourceful. Still, the hidden valleys protected many royal burials for centuries. Among the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time was the nearly intact tomb of the young king Tutankhamun. He ruled for only a short time. He accomplished relatively little compared with some pharaohs. Yet history remembers him more vividly than almost any other Egyptian ruler. Sometimes fame arrives through achievement, sometimes through remarkable good fortune. His tomb escaped large-scale robbery. When archaeologists entered in 1922, they found thousands of extraordinary objects: golden shrines, jewelry, weapons, furniture, clothing, food, chariots, musical instruments, and resting quietly within several nested coffins. The king himself. The discovery stunned the world. Newspapers carried the story across continents. Museums suddenly filled with visitors eager to learn about ancient Egypt. Interest in hieroglyphs, mummies, and pharaohs exploded. Designers borrowed Egyptian motifs. Architects embraced Egyptian styles. Even jewelry reflected ancient inspiration. For a time, much of the world developed a fascination with Egypt unlike anything seen before. Naturally, stories soon followed. Whispers spread about a mysterious curse. People claimed strange misfortunes had struck members of the excavation team. Newspapers eagerly connected unrelated deaths. Because newspapers have always appreciated a mysterious headline, the so-called Curse of the Pharaoh became famous. In reality, historians have found little convincing evidence of a supernatural curse. Most members of the expedition lived perfectly ordinary lives afterward. Reality, as it often does, proved considerably calmer than the rumors. And perhaps that is fitting. Ancient Egypt rarely needs exaggeration. Its true history is already extraordinary enough. Over the last century, archaeologists have become increasingly thoughtful about how mummies should be studied and displayed. Early excavations sometimes focused mainly on spectacular treasures. Gold captured attention. Gems filled museum cases. The people themselves occasionally became secondary. Today, many researchers approach ancient remains quite differently. They ask not only, what can we learn, but also, how can we learn respectfully? It is an important shift. After all, every mummy belonged to someone who expected peace, someone whose family mourned them, someone who believed these careful rituals would protect them forever. Modern archaeologists balance scientific curiosity with that understanding. Many museums now explain not only the burial process, but the humanity of the individual. Visitors learn about illnesses, careers, families, favorite foods, daily routines. The mummy becomes a person once again, not merely an exhibit. Perhaps that is one of the greatest gifts archaeology can offer. It restores individuality across thousands of years. A name, a face, a story, one by one, lives emerge from the silence of history. And as we slowly bring our own journey toward its close, it becomes easier to appreciate what the embalmers truly accomplished. Yes, they preserved bodies, but they also preserved memories. Without intending to, they created messages for distant generations. Messages written not with ink, but with linen, with resin, with careful hands, with astonishing patience. Every wrapped finger, every painted coffin, every tiny amulet tucked gently between layers of cloth. Each one quietly tells us the same thing. This person mattered. This life deserved to be remembered across more than 3 millennia. That message still reaches us. And perhaps tonight, as our own thoughts begin to grow pleasantly heavy, as the Nile drifts softly beneath the evening sky, as the desert settles once again into perfect stillness, we can leave the ancient embalmers to their patient work, still wrapping linen, still whispering prayers, still believing that kindness shown to the dead was one of the greatest kindnesses offered to the living. It is a remarkably peaceful thought to fall asleep with. Thank you for joining me on tonight's quiet journey through ancient Egypt. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time when we drift gently into another forgotten corner of history. Before we quietly leave ancient Egypt behind for the night, let's allow ourselves one final, unhurried walk through the civilization that devoted thousands of years to perfecting the art of remembering. The stars have appeared above the desert, the air has cooled, the Nile reflects the moonlight in long, gentle ribbons, just as it did for countless generations before the first pyramid was imagined. Somewhere in the distance, a temple stands silent. Its priests have finished the evening rituals. The incense has faded, only the stone remains. It is strange to think that the Egyptians themselves never called their civilization ancient. To them, it was simply the world. They woke before sunrise. They worried about crops. They argued with neighbors. They laughed with friends. Parents reminded children to behave. Children, quite predictably, often ignored the advice. History has a wonderful habit of reminding us that people separated by thousands of years are still, in many ways, remarkably familiar. When we hear the word mummy, our minds often jump immediately to museums, adventure films, hidden curses, or mysterious tombs. The Egyptians would probably find this rather amusing. To them, a mummy was not a mystery. It was a beloved parent, a respected teacher, a trusted official, a child whose family hoped they would live forever in another world. There was nothing frightening about careful preservation. It was an act of love, one performed with extraordinary patience. Imagine an embalmer arriving at work before dawn. He has practiced this craft for decades. His father may have taught him. His grandfather perhaps did the same. Every movement of his hands has become familiar through years of repetition. He mixes fragrant oils, cuts strips of linen, checks each wrapping carefully. Nothing is hurried, nothing is careless. He knows the family is trusting him with something irreplaceable, not merely a body, a future. It is difficult not to admire that quiet sense of responsibility. Throughout Egyptian history, these embalmers became highly respected specialists. Their knowledge remained practical rather than theoretical. They learned by observation, by experience, by watching what succeeded. Generation after generation refined the process. Without laboratories, without chemistry textbooks, without microscopes, simply through careful attention. Sometimes civilization advances not through dramatic discoveries, but through thousands of tiny improvements repeated patiently across centuries. The same could be said of the pyramid builders, or the stone carvers, or the scribes. Egypt was never built in a single glorious moment. It emerged slowly, block by block, harvest by harvest, flood by flood, century after century. Its stability became one of its greatest achievements. While neighboring kingdoms rose and vanished, Egypt often continued almost unchanged. The annual flooding of the Nile helped make this possible. Every summer, water overflowed its banks. Fresh black silt covered nearby fields. Farmers welcomed the flood rather than fearing it. When the waters retreated, rich soil remained behind. Crops flourished, grain stores filled, people ate, taxes were collected, temples received offerings, kings financed monuments. It all began with a river quietly following its ancient rhythm. The Egyptians never took that gift for granted. Many religious ceremonies expressed gratitude for the Nile. Without it, the surrounding desert would have made large-scale civilization nearly impossible. Water created life. Life created prosperity. Prosperity allowed extraordinary works of architecture, art, literature, and religion to flourish. Even the materials used in mummification depended upon this landscape. Flax fields supplied linen, the desert preserved bodies. Trees from distant lands provided aromatic resins. Natron came from dry lake beds. Everything connected, nothing existed entirely on its own. That interconnected view shaped Egyptian thinking. The living depended upon the dead. The dead depended upon the living. Gods protected humanity. Humanity honored the gods. The king maintained order, the people supported the kingdom, balance remained at the center of everything. Perhaps that explains why Ma'at occupied such an important place within Egyptian belief. Truth, justice, harmony, not perfection, simply balance. It is an idea that feels surprisingly modern. Life rarely asks us to become flawless. It asks us to keep restoring balance whenever it slips away. Of course, Egyptian history was not always peaceful. There were civil wars, foreign invasions, political rivalries, economic hardship, years when the Nile flooded poorly, years when it flooded too much. Powerful kingdoms challenged Egyptian borders, dynasties collapsed, new rulers arrived, yet even through enormous changes, many burial traditions continued. Kingdoms rose and fell. The careful wrapping of linen remained. Religious beliefs evolved. The hope for eternal life endured. There is something deeply reassuring about cultural traditions that survive such tremendous upheaval. Eventually, however, Egypt itself changed forever. The armies of great empires arrived, the Persians ruled, then came the Greeks under Alexander the Great. After his death, the Ptolemy I Soter established a new dynasty. Greek and Egyptian custom gradually blended together. Temples continued operating. Priests still performed ancient rituals. Yet the world was becoming something new. Centuries later, the Romans arrived. The old religion slowly faded, temples closed, hieroglyphs disappeared from everyday use. The knowledge of how to read them was eventually lost. Imagine that for a moment. An entire writing system, thousands upon thousands of inscriptions covering temples and tombs. And no one alive could understand them anymore. Stone remembered, people forgot. For nearly 1400 years, the walls remained silent. Travelers admired the beautiful carvings. They guessed at their meanings. Some imagined magical secrets. Others believed hieroglyphs were purely symbolic decorations. The truth waited patiently. It always had. Then, in 1799, during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, a remarkable object was discovered. Today, we know it as the Rosetta Stone. At first glance, it seemed rather ordinary, a broken slab of dark stone. But carved into its surface were the same texts written in 3 different scripts: Greek, Demotic, hieroglyphs. For scholars, it was the equivalent of finding a long-lost dictionary. Years of careful study followed. Finally, in the 1820s, the brilliant French scholar Jean-François Champollion successfully deciphered hieroglyphs. After centuries of silence, ancient Egypt could speak again. Names regained their voices. Prayers could be read. Royal decrees understood. Letters translated. The people who feared being forgotten had, in an unexpected way, achieved exactly what they hoped. Across thousands of years, someone remembered how to read their words. Today, archaeologists continue making discoveries. A newly uncovered tomb, an overlooked inscription, fragments of painted wood, tiny beads, simple sandals. Every object adds another sentence to the enormous story of ancient Egypt. Perhaps that story will never truly be finished. There will always be another question, another mystery, another quiet surprise waiting beneath the desert sand. And somehow that feels appropriate. After all, the Egyptians themselves believed that journeys rarely ended. They simply continued in different forms. So tonight, as we finally leave the cool stone tombs behind, as we walk back toward the gentle waters of the Nile, as the first hint of dawn begins to brighten the eastern horizon, we can look back one last time. Behind us lies a civilization that spent more than 3,000 years asking one peaceful question: How do we keep the people we love from being forgotten? Oh, their answer was not simple. It was carved into temples, painted onto coffins, wrapped carefully in linen, whispered in prayers, written in hieroglyphs, protected by stories, and preserved beneath the quiet sands of Egypt. Thousands of years later, those careful hands have succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined, because tonight we remembered them. And perhaps that is the gentlest kind of immortality history can offer. Thank you for drifting through ancient Egypt with me. Rest well, sleep deeply, and until our next quiet journey into the past, good night.